Space is an interesting thing because a lot of people really like to think about it. Like when I was a kid, I loved to think about it because it seems so vast and difficult to comprehend. And the idea of space and like that I was a part of it, as a kid, it made me feel like bigger. And that was super empowering. But the nice paradox is that in order to actually engage in space exploration, you are ultra confined in a very tiny space. I mean, the International Space Station and those modules are just jammed packed full of stuff. When you're out in space, you're in a spacesuit. You're contained, you're confined. It's the smallest spaceship there is. And a Mars habitat, I think really what would happen is it would have to be inside a cave somewhere to shield from radiation, cosmic rays and solar rays. So, and you're going to have the bubble that you're in anyway. And so, I mean, you go so far to explore and like embiggen, I guess, humanity, but you are stuck like in a dome inside a cave.
Greetings, future fossils. This is Michael Garfield welcoming you to another episode of the podcast that explores our place in time. This week we have science journalist and former laser physicist Kate Greene on the show. Kate is another in the long list of amazing people I met through the Santa Fe Institute and their Interplanetary Festival this summer. Amazingly, I now know more than one person who has lived for an extended period of time in a simulated space colony, which is kind of cool, but not as cool as being one of those people. Kate's writing has also touched on artificial intelligence and big data and the changing relationship of human beings to our environment of knowledge. She's also taught creative writing in women's prisons, which I find especially interesting. There's kind of a through line that we discuss later on in this episode. A theme of mind and imagination in relationship to confinement, and how some of the biggest adventures we can have take place in some of the smallest places. But first, I want to thank everybody who has been supporting this show on Patreon, including this week's new supporter, Dave Hodgins. Securing, recording, editing, and publishing these interviews every week takes an unbelievable amount of time, and this is a one-person operation. So your support really makes this show possible, and I'm deeply, deeply grateful to everyone who's chipping in $2, $5, $10, $20 a month. It's good to know that so many of you out there agree that these are vital conversations, that these ideas and these issues deserve thoughtful and in-depth exploration. I've been a professional painter, a fine artist for the last 10 years, and I've always squeaked by. But living from painting sale to painting sale is really precarious and scary, and it makes a huge difference to know that every month I'm going to be able to pay my bills and find the time to work on this show and to grow it and nurture it and give it the love and the energy that it needs. So thank you again. And thanks to everybody, the 100+ people that have reviewed this show on iTunes, which I think all of you probably know is one of the most effective strategies for getting these podcasts into the ears and minds of people that we'll never otherwise meet. And for me, the biggest and most important part of this entire project is bringing people who otherwise might never encounter one another into conversation, into the synergy and the possibility. And yeah, that means telling your friends and your family when you hear a great episode, but that also means letting strangers know you think this show is cool. And one of the best ways to do that is by reviewing it. So again, thanks everybody who's been doing that. If you want a more intimate experience and special access, please do go check out patreon.com/Michael Garfield and learn about all of the perks that are afforded you by becoming a paying member of this community. And for everyone, no matter your affluence or lack of affluence, there's the Facebook discussion group where I post new interesting stuff almost every day. And now there's a ton of other regular users in the group who are doing the same, and it's really lively and wonderful. So go look us up on Facebook if you aren't in there already. And lastly, a special shout out to transhumanity.net, this show's featured sponsor, working on making artificial general intelligence safe and available to everyone and not merely the province of some freaky military industrial elite. Way to go, you guys. Go to transhumanity.net and check out their extensive archives of interesting media, as well as their new podcast, which is produced and published entirely by AI. Very interesting experiment there. That's it, folks. We've got some great episodes in the weeks to come, including a fabulous conversation with Mark Nelson, one of the 8 brave souls who locked themselves inside Biosphere 2 back in the 1990s, as well as with Patricia Eastman, a facilitator of plant medicine ceremonies. But for now, I present Kate Greene, science journalist, explorer, creative writer, interesting person. Enjoy, and I'll see you next week. Kate Greene, welcome to Future Fossils.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Yeah. So you are, I don't know which number you are. I think you're number 3 on the release schedule of cool people I found out about at Interplanetary Festival at Santa Fe Institute. And they had you there in part because of your science writing, in part because of your experience with physics, and then in part because you participated in a Mars colony simulation. So you're an interesting, well-rounded person. And why don't we start just like, how did you get into the sciences and science writing? I guess that's probably the right place to launch this.
Oh, sure. It's a great question. Yeah, the Interplanetary Festival was a fantastic place to meet a lot of interesting people and just get a lot of new ideas. So I'm not surprised that you collected a bunch of interviews from that experience. But as far as my science writing goes, I mean, as a kid, I was always interested in science. I wanted to be an astronaut. That really, I had a sort of spaceward bent. I was super into black holes. In 4th grade, I had a subscription to Science News magazine. I don't know if you know about that one. It's like a little pamphlet that is pretty thin. It comes out like every 2 weeks now, but at the time it came out every week, and it was just like all the science news you could want. And I would just devour it for all of the black hole news and all of the astrophysics. So in 4th grade, I had determined that I would become an astrophysicist. So that kept my interest for a long time. High school happened and I was okay at math, but I wasn't great at math, and that didn't feel good. It didn't feel good to be not great at math. So I kind of thought maybe physics isn't for me. I also took some physics classes that I'm going to say, looking back, were not that well taught, but I didn't excel in either. In fact, my only 2 C's in my high school career came in Calculus 2 and Physics 2 my senior year. I mean, I might have had a case of senioritis at that point too, but yeah, so I wasn't some rock star physicist mathematician in high school. And I was thinking, well, I like biology. I seem to be able to connect the dots pretty well in all of my bio classes, and chemistry is fine too. So I went to college for biology.
Me too.
Oh yeah? What kind of biology were you interested in?
Evolutionary and ecology. It was combined programs at the University of Kansas. So I was doing paleo-ecological stuff during the summers. So that was where I wanted to take it. But
whoa, wait, when were you at the University of Kansas?
2001 to 2005.
Okay, we completely overlapped. That's
What?
Exactly when I was at the University of Kansas doing physics. Yes.
Whoa, crazy.
I mean, 2001 to 2004. And I know people in the anthropology department. Do you know Christina Warner?
No, I never really got deep into anthro, but I definitely was in the physics building sometimes.
Hall. Yeah.
I was in Malott and Hayworth and Dyke for a lot of the museum hall for a lot of the upper level courses, and crazy. So Rock Chalk Jayhawks and all of that.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I actually have a great suggestion, a KU alum that you might want to look into. She, her name's Christina Warner, and she's done TED Talks, and she's a very well-known anthropologist. She kind of designed the field of whatever it is. She uses dental calculus on ancient teeth to determine like the diets of ancient people. And following like the evolution of gut microbiomes around the world. This is her research. She's kind of invented it from the ground up. There are basically two groups that do it now. And she's in Germany at a Max Planck Institute. So, I'd highly recommend. I'll send you information about her.
Yeah, please.
I think that you guys would have a really interesting conversation. Yeah, so crazy. Nice connection. Yeah, Rock Chalk. Amazing. But I went to KU for grad school. Before that, I went to a very small liberal arts college in Kansas called St. Mary College. It's now the University of St. Mary, and that's in Leavenworth.
Yeah, my sister lives in Leavenworth.
Yeah. So that tiny little campus. That's where I wanted to be a biologist. I got there and I was just like, I want to learn about, cancer research and maybe contribute something to the world. And then, through a couple semesters of classes, I was not really getting too excited about the stuff I was learning, and was finding that I was much more interested in chemistry. And then, I took an intro physics class in college and really kind of killed it. I was just like, wow, evidently I'm pretty good at physics. And so I thought, well, why don't I do as much physics as I can? The problem was, since it was such a small school, there wasn't a physics major. There's a chemistry major, and I took physical chemistry, and then I convinced the physical chemistry professor to teach me an extra physics course, and I was maxing out on my math courses because I had great professors to teach math, and they wanted me to be a math major, and I thought, no, you're not talking to the right person. Like, there's no way I could be a math major. But it turns out I'm actually okay at math. I think I just had bad teaching, and I think that happens to a lot of people, and it really discourages a lot of people. So in college, I had a complete shift in identity in terms of what I was capable of mathematically, and then also what my interest was. Again, back to physics. My fourth grade self was emerging again to think about black holes and fun stuff. Although I ended up focusing on lasers because that had my chemistry background played well into looking at semiconductor lasers and LEDs, which is what I ended up doing in grad school.
Whoa! Okay. So I just started using a desktop laser cutter and engraver.
Ooh, fun.
Just about a week ago. I had it pre-ordered for 2 years before it arrived, and then it sat on a table looking menacing and daunting for about 8 months, and then finally my friends pushed my ass into the pool by commissioning me to do laser engraved acrylic tickets for their festival. So I'm in laser zone right now, and primed to be excited about whatever you were researching in grad school.
Well, laser cutters and engravers and even laser pointers are really interesting and fun and super tangible applications. And I was not working anywhere near those. So the sort of lasers I was working with mid-infrared lasers and LEDs, which are invisible. The light that they emit is invisible, and the applications are chemical sensing, military countermeasures, to sort of deflect heat-seeking missiles, that sort of thing. So we got Department of Defense funding.
That's boring.
Well, and NHS funding for glucose, subcutaneous glucose sensing. So developing glucose monitors for people who are diabetic or have an insulin sensitivity for under the skin.
Oh, that reminds me, not to totally take us off track, but you heard that thing, I'm sure, about judges being more charitable after lunch, like on the cases that happen right after lunch because their blood sugar is higher. And I feel like there could be, like in the future, we're going to have robots with infrared blood glucose detection capacity that are going to know when to talk to somebody and when not to get a different result.
Like red flag, green flag.
Yeah, this blood sugar's too low to have a conversation with this person right now.
I feel like mothers are very good at that with their children. Like 4 p.m. rolls around and they just shove a snack at their kids. Like they're very good at glucose detection.
So,
yeah, I guess that takes me up to my grad school days. I was always writing. Like as a kid, I wrote stories, science fiction stories, and in college, I wrote for the literary magazine. It was just what a bunch of students put together for St. Mary College. It wasn't anything too fancy, but I would write, I think I did like a short sort of like layperson's explanation for the special theory of relativity, just seeing if like what I could get away with, like if the literary people at the school would be like, no way, you can't put this in here, or like, yes, we'll take it. And so anyway, they decided to cut me some slack and they let me do that. And I think I did something else about like the Tacoma Narrows bridge disaster and the harmonics. So kind of explaining the differential equations that could describe why that bridge collapsed. So what I loved about St. Mary, for me, it was a liberal arts school. It is a liberal arts college. And so all of my science classes and my math classes were very integrated with storytelling of some sort. So I was often writing creative papers in my math classes and in my physics classes. They were either assignments, or if they weren't like explicit assignments, I would kind of ask to either modify an assignment or just like do it on my own. And the professors were really okay with that. So I got to do a lot of stuff at St. Mary College. I published like original chemistry research, like in the Journal of Computational Chemistry as an undergrad, and that was pretty unusual. I mean, it was like, small schools are great if you kind of go in with a lot of energy and really become friends with the professors and allow them to mentor you. You know what I mean? So yeah, it was a great time. Gosh, you're just getting me. I'm thinking back. I'm feeling very nostalgic. And I also played volleyball, and that was a fun thing. I was there on scholarship to play volleyball. So like my whole college experience was really quite wonderful. And that launched me into grad school. And in grad school, let's see, I joined the American Astronautical Society, like the KU chapter of that. It was basically a bunch of aerospace engineers who wanted to be astronauts. And so I dipped into that crowd and told them I'd write their newsletter for them. So that there was some writing there. I became obsessed with science journalism at that point. And I was reading all the science journalism I could. I was reading books about journalism. I was like by fire hose taking in a sort of journalistic education just everywhere I could get it. I wasn't necessarily doing it other than writing this newsletter, which wasn't journalistic at all. It was just, putting something together every month or so. But I was really gearing my brain toward explaining technical topics to a lay audience. So by the end of my 3 years, I got a master's degree, and since I went in with a chemistry degree, I took an extra year of like upper level undergraduate physics classes, and then I did 2 years of like a master's program. So I came out with an MS. But I had a professor who really liked the way I wrote my lab reports, and he one day slipped an issue of The Economist in my mailbox and like opened to the page where they had their call for science writing interns. So it's called the Casement Internship. And I saw that, I read that like little is in a blue box, like at the bottom of the page. And I read it, and like instantly I started to get like sweaty palms. I had a physical response to that in this way that, I mean, it sounds absurd because I didn't actually know that I would get it, but like I felt like there was nothing more right for me. And so I went to the library, read all the Economist science and technology sections from, I don't know, 2 or 3 years back. just to really integrate the voice of the magazine into like my own thinking, and because it has such a distinct voice, and also to see like what sort of topics they were covering, what would be interesting. And such a great thing happened. I came across at KU some research that was not yet published, was going to be published, and I knew it would be. I knew that it would make a great topic. It was about gamma ray bursts and the possible link between a nearby gamma ray burst and mass extinctions on Earth.
Oh, hot damn. We're getting into it now. Okay. Excuse me.
Oh, I feel like I hit the absolute jackpot because I had the researchers right there at the University of Kansas. And I knew from reading all these back issues that is definitely a topic of interest, but like that topic and that actual research hadn't been covered. And then there was also like a legitimate science writer at KU named Roger Martin, who one of the physicists put me in touch with. And this guy read over my application letter and the subsequent story that I wrote, and gave me a few tips. And, I was just like lousy with resources to make this thing happen. And it happened. In 2004, I went to London and I became a science writer via The Economist. And it was an incredible, like, just a jumpstart into a science writing career. I feel extremely lucky.
Yeah, it's interesting listening to all this stuff that you're saying. There are so many points along the way. You said it yourself about the difference between a good teacher and a bad teacher, and what a difference that makes in the formation of a person's passion in a particular area, and just the being rewarded early on, getting that, like, forming the dopamine circuit. It's like, oh, my parents think I'm great at piano, I'm going to keep playing piano, or whatever it is. And just, it's funny. I think so many people think that there are, and to some degree there must be people that are just like born athletes or born musicians or born journalists, but it's amazing how contingent that seems, and just how it's like, I think it's important on some sort of cultural level to remember just how, I think it has a lot less to do with the type of person and a lot more to do with the type of reinforcement that we get.
I think that is a fascinating observation. And I think it took me a little bit to realize that that's what's going on. So like going back and telling my story, I could very easily tell the story of I did this, I did that, and not mention at all the teachers, the mentors that like kept showing up. And what you said about like parents encouraging you, oh my gosh, my parents were nothing but supportive of any ridiculous thing I wanted to do. And they were the ones who got me the subscription to Science News magazine when I was a precocious fourth grader wanting to be an astrophysicist. And they didn't say it might be above your reading level. They said, sure, here it is, And so, yeah, absolutely encouraged from a very young age. And then it like a self-reinforcing loop for sure, I'd have to say. So everything that I've done is like the result of like network effects and just this web that I've grown up in, that's cocooned me, that's allowed me to change and grow and learn, and then, go from there. So yeah, that's a really good observation.
I'm curious about what network effects got you into a simulated Mars habitat on Hawaii. Like what's the story with that?
Well, I had been a science writer for a while, so I guess I saw 2013. It must have been early 2012. I should have this date more solid in my mind.
Well, everything before 2013 is pre-apocalyptic. So it's like, it's state-specific memory. It's like you probably weren't on your phone the majority of time back then.
Well, I was on Twitter a lot, and I can tell you that's part of why that's the main reason why I did the Mars experience, because it was late 2011 or early 2012, and I was bored, most likely because I was scrolling through Twitter or trying to avoid work. I was freelance writing at the time, living in Nashville, with my wife. She was going to Vanderbilt for her MFA in fiction, and I came along, and it was great because my work was portable, and so I was writing some stories for, I think, like Discover Magazine, U.S. News, World Reports, and just like scrolling through Twitter, and I saw this NPR article on why astronauts like Tabasco sauce in space, and I thought, well, gosh, I wonder, and so I clicked, and at the very bottom of the article, so I mean, I guess long story short. Stuffy noses because of low gravity shifts fluid in your body, and so you can't taste food as well. And so there's a theory that as an astronaut, the reason why astronauts tend to eat less over time when they're in space, and that is a real effect, is one reason might be because they don't get as much enjoyment out of food because they have stuffed up noses. They can't taste it as well.
Again, with the reinforcement. Holy crap. And then you think of like the aliens. Sorry, this is just this notion from the exopolitical folklore that the little gray men that are visiting our planet ostensibly are actually future human beings that are like going backward in time, and they've got they look like fetuses. They've got those tiny little mouths, and it's like, well, that's because they've been living in space for 20,000 years.
Yeah, that's right. This is what happens.
Yeah, they're just sort of pallid and probably on a drip. Anyway, so it makes sense.
And you're not using limbs so much.
Yeah. Who cares? You're just floating around.
Yep.
It must be great, really. But anyway, so there you were.
Yeah. So there I was learning about astronaut noses, and at the end of the article was a call to participate in a study that was going to explore this question further. And I thought, well, okay, what is that about? And I clicked on that, and that took me to a page that was, it was like my wildest imagination. In my wildest imagination, I couldn't have conceived of such a thing. It was a call for participants to be fake astronauts for 4 months in a simulated Mars habitat in Hawaii to study space food systems. And, as I read more, I saw, limited water usage, limited resources. You bring your own science experiment to keep you busy. You're there with 5 other people. You can't go outside except when wearing spacesuits. And you're basically providing data for NASA for a possible future mission to Mars. And once again, my palms started to sweat. My heart began to race. I had a very physical response to the thought of me doing this thing that I was reading about. And I thought, wow, this is really for me. So I applied. And I applied as a science journalist and as a scientist because that I have both as my background. And I kept my application short because I figured they'd get a lot of them. And turns out I made it to the top 9 and then made it to the top 6. So that's how that happened.
So what do you think it is about that response, that physical response? Because, do you ever get that and it's a dud? Like, do you ever get that and it just turns out that you're not on the right track? Or do you think that that's a clue? And this is a question I don't really get to talk to people with like a rigorous scientific background. I talk to a lot of people that just sort of take it for granted that, there's a lot of information your body is processing that doesn't make it up to the conscious level, and that the intuition is in some sense, a valid disclosure of something.
It's an interesting question. And there's a chance that I've minimized the times when it's happened and like the result hasn't been positive, but I don't actually think I get it that often. Because it's profound, it's a very sure feeling, and it makes me a little uncomfortable because, I hate to think that, well, part of it is like, is it ego? Is it confidence? Or is it just like recognition of a really good match with like my interests and my desires and an opportunity that I encounter? And maybe it happens too with people you meet, like, and that you just know that this is an important person for you too. I think that there's something similar there actually.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's almost like meeting a person that you're just like, oh, this is going to be a really important person in my life. I need to be friends with them, and just kind of following through. And then yeah, it it's worked out for me. Another thing happened too recently. Well, within the past few years, I applied to grad schools to do an MFA in poetry, and I applied to three schools, but the one I became like really obsessed with was Columbia University, and um, yeah, I was accepted and I got fellowship money, and am doing that. I'm finishing up my second and last year, starting actually this September. So that's been kind of like my third big experience with like, what am I going to do with my life? And these things present themselves, and then but I feel like there's something in me that really goes after it too.
Yeah. Well, see, that's my thinking on this lately, because the last time I experienced something like that came after I had a pretty solid editorial gig a couple of years ago, and then suddenly I didn't. And ever since, I've been like, what am I doing? In this sort of malaise of I should be in a different place in my life by now. And then then started the podcast, and that gives me something to occupy myself while I'm still like, a Jew in the wilderness for 40 years, kind of in between sure things. And then, not to, hex this event or whatever, but Santa Fe Institute posted their social media specialist gig this summer when I was starting to talk to them about doing this interview series. And they actually sent me the position, and were really as supportive in it as they could professionally be. And I had the same sort of like, I've been like sweaty about this for months as this thing has gone on. And it's been this thing where it's like everyone I've spoken to about it is like, yes, I can't imagine anyone more suited for this. But the point is not necessarily so much the intuition piece of it, although that may be part of it, but also that when you get that excited about something, it's like, all other things being equal, there's the red team and the blue team, and the red, we know physiologically that red intimidates the opponent. That that there's something about seeing blood or whatever, that the red team has a small but statistically significant advantage over the blue team just for the color.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was like part of why they paint a lot of prisons pink, because it supposedly subdues people and it leads to a diminishment of prison riots. So I think about that with respect to this kind of an event, where it's like maybe we have it backwards, and it's the physiological response that makes you like lift a car off of your kid or whatever, that it's just you're like super powered in your like application skills. You're just like, I need this, I must have it. And they're like, oh wow, that person is a intense.
Yeah, it just shines. Something about you is just like shimmering to other people, and so there's no way it's not happening. Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah. Which comes first? It's a really.
Or is causation just totally the mistake here, and that these are, because there's other people that we've talked to on the show, and we're stepping a little into the deep end here, but because of your abiding lifelong interest in black holes, I feel like this is a safe place to go with you. That there's some kind of compelling evidence out of some engineering anomalies research departments, notably Princeton's, that we can measure the influence of an emotionally significant event on random number generators before it even happens. And that there's like a bell curve of statistical skewing away from the normal and into standard deviations of patterned numerical outputs from these machines of all different kinds, that seems to suggest that there is some sort of disturbance or measurable phenomenon of some mysterious kind surrounding events like 9/11 or the election of Barack Obama on worldwide networks of random number generators. And so this suggestion that that we do actually receive information of some kind from the future. And if that's the case, then our sort of time's arrow of cause and effect is going to be pretty dramatically repainted as like a matrix of moments sort of contributing to each other or something. I don't know.
Right. I mean, the study of this sort of thing, it's gone in and out of fashion, and it's interesting. I hadn't heard about the Princeton research, but like SRI in Silicon Valley, Stanford Research Institute, famously looked at sort of psychic phenomenon. I'm not saying that this is the same thing, but like legitimate research funds went to understanding communication between people that wasn't potentially measurable consistently, but seemed to leave some sort of physical evidence of its existence. So I think I'm always interested in what sort of questions can get asked in science, and what's okay to ask and what isn't, and like the framing of it. And so I'm definitely going to look into this random event generators issue.
It's the Global Consciousness Project is what they call it now. After I think it's just, oh gosh.
Oh yeah, I see it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's after they closed the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab after 27 years and did some like intense metastatistical studies on their own publications to show that the so-called file drawer effect, which for listeners is an argument used against extraordinary claims, that for every one published finding suggesting something like psychic phenomena or information from the future is real, there must be all of these other unpublished negative findings. And their metastatistical analysis of their own research suggested that there have to be, I think it was like millions or maybe even billions of unpublished negative results for their stuff to be inconsequential. So yeah, if you do look it up, I'd be super fascinated to know what another rigorous process science oriented person would think of that. But I want to get into, we've been on this for like 40 minutes, and I want to get into your actual experience. There's a couple things I hope that we can get to on this. One is your experience in the Mars simulation. And then one is, you have on your Twitter profile photo, you have a picture of a baby electroencephalogram. And we've brought up parenting a couple times on this one too. So I'm just very, whichever one you want to stab first, I guess.
Well, sure. That one's easy. I'm not a parent, but I have a lot of friends who are parents and family members who are parents. So that picture just came from a New York Times article about some study done with babies, some sort of brain study with babies. And I don't remember exactly what it was. It was a long time ago, but I kind of love the idea of just an innocent child being probed so profoundly by and what is it? I'm bumbling on, but the EEG. And so I just thought it was a perfect picture. But also for a long time, I've been interested in just, we communicate with people and we use facial cues and body language and also the words that are coming out of their mouths and the way that they intonate their words. And there are a lot of ways that we pick up information about other people. But one thing I've always sort of wished would be possible would be some sort of visual representation of their brain activity when they get excited or perplexed, or and something happens in a conversation or just anywhere when they're out and about. I wish that little extra information could be there, and interpreted appropriately. But like, what part is lighting up and why? And for different people, it's going to be different things. And so I often wonder, like, what the hell is my brain doing right now? Because like, I'm so excited. I wish I could like see something happening inside. And the same with other people, friends or whoever, or if we're just like having a great time out, like what are our brains actually doing? So I like to pretend that I could imagine the inner workings of the brains of the people around me. And so that's why that picture really spoke to me.
Did you ever listen to any of Terence McKenna's old talks? The ethnobotanist. He was famous for popularizing the methods by which to cultivate psychedelic mushrooms. He and his brother. But he was this very interesting author and sort of pre-internet psychedelic raconteur, and he would talk a lot about virtual reality and the future of, like post-modernity. This sort of like a revival of the archaic traditions and so on. And one of the things that he talked about was getting back to this sort of like using technology to get back to a state of telepathy where, like cuttlefish, we are broadcasting our internal states on our skin. And that we would, he thought that we would move sort of beyond verbal communication and into this sort of constant, like ambient techno telepathy, where you would just always know what's going on inside somebody. Just like you're
in a way,
about.
That is what Twitter does, and it has done on a very global scale. So
especially if you have no filter, right? Yeah,
right. And so many people don't. So that's what's happening. Never in the history of humanity have we had such extensive communication prosthetics, and that's what Twitter is. That's what Facebook is. I mean, this global chatter, but like the ambient awareness of all of these conversations that are going on and how people are responding to them emotionally. It's all there and it's all available to dip in and dip out of. I mean, it's too much for just like a single brain to actually comprehend. And, so of course we would need the help, and, there are plenty of researchers and companies that are developing the artificial intelligence algorithms to like suss out actual semantic meaning. But even then, it's kind of not clear what exactly we're finding. So I'm really interested in these communication networks that are, we don't really even know what they can do, other than we've seen how quickly disinformation can spread and how damaging that can be to like the sense of our reality, our collective reality as people who are trying to make decisions based on information. I think that that's one sort of like unintended consequence that we're just at the very early stages of exploring. But I think that there's a lot more to come when it, in terms of what's possible and what's going to happen with these sort of communication networks.
Oh my God. This is something you brought up something we talk about on the show a lot, which is how navigating the so-called infoquake, what Rich Doyle calls the infoquake, and how, I don't remember who it was, somebody on NPR, it was another science writer was talking about this the other day, and I was so grateful that this was on public radio, that they were explaining, that most scientists, most of the time, are still having to basically take the claims of experts in other fields on faith. This is like there's a level of comfort, like there's a threshold where we accept somebody's authority in a particular area, and we're willing to listen to what they say, and it doesn't feel like we're just exerting blind faith. But as the world gets more and more complex, or at least like relevantly complex, right, then even the experts in these various fields are starting to discover that they're having a hard time keeping up with their own super weirdly specific micro subdiscipline, because there's papers on it published in like 5 different languages, and they're all behind paywalls, and like there's people working on it like on in like top secret programs at the same time as they're working on it in public programs, and like nobody can possibly keep up with anything anymore, or that's the sense that we get, right? So what does that look like to you as a science journalist and as a scientist, and like how do you think that we're gonna make it through this without just totally succumbing to fake news or reliance, just putting it one step removed from that, reliance on a sort of black box algorithm to verify information for us, an algorithm we don't understand,
Whoa, that's an intense question. And I love that it has 3 implicit parts to it. Like, what do I think of the huge amount of information as a scientist? What do I think of it as a science journalist? And then will we succumb to black box algorithms? Is that a fair summary?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, this is like, where do we?
Yeah.
If we can't trust other scientists to be experts, and we still rely on some. I mean, I'm sure that I'm not the only person in this audience, this listening audience, that has had a post automatically flagged for abuse by Facebook by some thing.
Wow,
that's
yeah.
like, and you're just like, hey, wait a minute. So
yeah,
it's like,
exactly.
can you imagine your peer review is actually like HAL 9000? What the hell do you do? you know?
Yeah. Well, I mean, okay, so as a scientist and knowing that you can't necessarily just trust the person who's been in the field doing it the longest because they might not be as up to date or, who your go-to experts are and just like work from that. I mean, I think that's a great thing because science is so human. It's performed by human beings who have all of these biases and blind spots, and to trust an individual to like give you the right answer in all contexts, or a handful of experts or whatever, is I mean, it's narrowing. It actually doesn't work the best way. So I think that the fact that there is so much more information does point to the fact that there needs to be another way to sift through it. So you mentioned just like behind paywalls or in other languages. So there are structural challenges to that for sure, systemic challenges. But I do think that using algorithms is a very good approach. And I don't think that all algorithms have to be black boxes. I think that some deep learning or neural networks have that characteristic built into their fundamental design. But there are also researchers who are very invested in trying to figure out a way to, I mean, it sounds like algorithms on top of algorithms, but develop algorithms to explain those algorithms. And, but like at a certain level, you pull out and you have explainability like accessible, so like maybe the ones that are doing like the deep research on the huge amounts of data are the ones that are more difficult to explain, that would need an algorithm to explain that. But maybe that next level of algorithm doesn't need the explainability because you can interrogate it in a more straightforward way, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So I'm speaking from the perspective of someone who has just last year I ghost wrote a book on artificial intelligence for a CTO of a major technology consultancy. So I have, as a science writer, I have a little bit of a background in artificial intelligence. So I'm speaking from from the perspective of someone who's done some research in this. So I'm not just speaking off the cuff.
You're also performing, I think, what will become a sort of inherent piece of the future syntax, which is like current science writing doesn't really put a lot of pressure on the researchers to explain who they are and like what perspective they're speaking from. And it feels like that's going to be one of those things that as the domain of research gets more and more subtle, like you're doing these things where the beliefs of the researcher may influence the outcome of the experiment, then that kind of stuff becomes essential.
Absolutely. And so context is absolutely crucial. And that's the thing that right now artificial intelligence is terrible at. And that's why there will always, not always, but in the foreseeable future, need to be people who are aware of the context that algorithms lack and able to provide that. A lot of people think that AI is just going to like do a Control F replace for people in a lot of ways. But I feel like, and this is based on a lot of the research that I've done, that it is going to be one of the most intimate symbiotic relationships that we have in the future. It is, I mean, this technology will become as close to human as anything humanity's ever created. And it's not going to be able to do it on its own. It's going to be a symbiosis, and we will be learning from each other and training each other. So, but the context is incredibly valuable to all that. And also, I love the idea of what if science journalists, instead of just writing the straight news story, like dove in a little deeper. There are some who do that. I think like at the Atlantic, Ed Young is very, very good at that. And you get a few others who, Kenneth Chang at New York Times, who do this very well. Natalie Wolkovia at Quanta magazine. I don't know. Let me see if I.
Ed Young. He was the guy that. Oh my God, I love his stuff. He's the guy that was writing about the microbiome. I contain multitudes.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
Natalie Walkover at Quantum Magazine also tells a
Ooh.
really compelling full story about, she writes a lot about particle physics and cosmology. And so there's a type of science journalism that happens out there that is more in depth and provides great context, but it's not necessarily the science journalism or the science news that pops up on Facebook feeds, because Facebook and just the quick link culture really tends to gravitate toward the compelling headline and then a very short description of what's going on. So this gets into what science writers, the relationship of science writers to all this information that's out there, all these studies that are coming out, whatnot. There's a real incentive for a science journalist who's on the sort of like daily news churn to find the most eye-catching story and write about it as quickly as possible. And so if you're a science journalist, most science journalists have the job of, just like summarizing a research finding and putting it out into the world, not necessarily putting it in context. And it's pretty, I think I'm afraid that has, while it's created a lot of jobs for science journalists, I'm afraid that it has been damaging in some ways to science. Although science has its own issues, I'm not going to say. I think that there's something of there's a relational issue here. So scientists really have an incentive to get headlines as they're writing grants and up for tenure. So there's that system of incentives that mean that, scientists want to get the most eye-catching. They want to follow the sexiest research, right? And then they're putting out these studies, and then science journalists pick them up and then put them out. So it's a little bit of like the incentives are kind of perverse and producing a lot of noise in scientific discovery right now. And in conclusion, I believe that algorithms that are shepherded by very context-aware humans can be used to make a little bit more sense of it.
That reminds me of that piece that came out recently that just tore up the internet about how cephalopods have extraterrestrial DNA. Oh my God, that was so annoying. And like, yeah. Anyway, not necessarily a lot to cover there, except that that's a perfect example of where the drive for researchers to hype up their research, to magnetize interest and funding, and the drive of journalists to cover something like profound and weird is coming together to form a vicious moiré of knowledge eroding. This is exactly, I mean, let's please not get into this, but this is exactly where this sort of thing, so many people don't understand conspiracy, because the whole thing is all you have to do is have an incentive landscape that organizes people's incentives toward a collusion of some kind, like the deep state. Of course, we need criminal informants in these organized crime organizations. So like, it just happens, and it's not like the cops are necessarily, sitting, smoking cigars with the mob bosses laughing about how much trouble they're going to cause. Anyway, so you lived on a Mars habitat.
Yes, I did. That happened. And it's a project that's still happening. It's an ongoing project. Yeah.
We're doing a lot of hairpin turns on this conversation.
Yeah, no, I love it. It's pretty fun.
But yeah, so you were on Mauna Loa, and why Hawaii? Well,
so simulated Mars habitats or space habitats come in a lot of different forms, and they're all over the world. There's one that's underwater. There's one in Morocco. There's one a friend who was on the mission with me just did in Poland, a 2-week moon simulation. There is one on Devon Island in Canada, and that's extremely remote. There's some in Houston at Johnson Space Center, the facility. There's one called the Mars Desert Research Station in Hanksville, Utah. And what these have in common is isolation, some sort of isolation factor. So even if you're in Houston, you're inside a building and you're like in some facility that you can't get out. But if you're in Hanksville, Utah, then someone has to drive a very long time to reach you. But if you think about like Devon Island, that is an extremely remote location. So you have extreme isolation happening there. And if there's an injury, if something goes wrong, it could be a very long time until you're able to be evacuated or someone can come rescue you. So one of the great things about the high seas facility on Mauna Loa is that it's easily accessible by helicopter. So if there's a medical emergency, and there was in the last mission, medical personnel can access that site easily. But it's remote enough, so it takes like an hour from a sort of civilization, or maybe 2 hours, depending on what you call civilization, to get at it. So you have the great environment, great isolated environment, but you also have like something, some built-in safety mechanisms. But have you ever been to Hawaii?
Yeah.
So
you think about the lava flows, everywhere. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So like the first question is, the first actual reason is because it looks like Mars, because it's red. It has geological structures that we might find on Mars, like lava tubes, so caves created by coursing lava that we know exist on Mars, and actually even the Moon for that matter. And these are really interesting structures. So if you have geologists on the crew, you can go out and do some actual studies that might be relevant to researchers who are interested in the geology of Mars as well. So
not if you're not in a spacesuit, right?
Yeah, you can't go out just in your shirt sleeves because we know that environment, there's just very little atmosphere out there.
Right. And that's got to be like the most torturous way to spend 4 months in Hawaii.
Yeah, it wasn't the best. Afterwards I definitely swam in the ocean, but I do have to say, and I definitely got sunburned because I did not have direct sunlight for 4 months, and I'm a very pale person. Well, when I came out, like we all came out and we had a press event. We were the first mission, the first high seas mission. So, there was a lot of press there, and they were very curious to know how we got along, and all these questions. But I put on a ton of sunscreen because the whole thing was conducted outdoors, and we were eating like fresh fruits and vegetables for the first time in 4 months, which was so lovely. But, I just kept the sunscreen going because I'm super susceptible to burn. I'm super susceptible to burning. And day 2, I still hadn't even gotten any color whatsoever back on my skin because I was so afraid. So I just, without sunscreen at all, stood in a parking lot outside of the place where we were eating breakfast, and I went up in flames. Basically, I was red for 3 days afterwards. It was pretty terrible. So I just think about actually going to Mars and just never feeling the sun on your skin again, or the breeze from like the wind just going through, like moving through your hair. I think that it would be very difficult. You could simulate it. You could have some tanning beds. You could have a fan. You can find some ways to simulate this. But Earth is so wonderful, and I don't think I knew it. I kind of knew it, but I didn't actually know it until I couldn't be a part of it for 4 months.
So there was another person at Interplanetary Fest that talked about being a part of a Mars mission, Nina Lanza. And on her panel, she talked about, she was in Antarctica, so she got the cold piece of it also, and said that when, it being that cold, you couldn't smell anything ever, because there's just no volatile particles in the air, and how she was thinking about like how difficult it was and how profoundly grateful she was to smell things again, and how she thought that going to Mars, that one of the best things that we could do, I guess it's like the hot sauce, right? One of the best things that we could do for astronauts would be to send them up into space with like a spice box of essential oils of different kinds of plants and like fragrances that mean something to them. Because
I believe that completely.
Yeah. So absolutely. I was going to ask you what kind of stuff you really like that kind of stuff. What kind of stuff you missed in there, and what do you think are the weird, maybe like surprising things that we would want to bring into space with us that we take for granted?
Well, I guess 2 things come to mind. The first is, like essential oils seem like a very, very good idea. We did a lot of odor identification tests because that was part of our study. We just a quick summary. We were looking at two food systems. One food system is like the pouch meals that astronauts on the ISS eat. So just add water and heat, and you're ready to go. So they're very quick to make, quick to clean up. They don't taste that great. They might be over salted. They might be over fatted. They might just not have a great flavor profile. And over time, because they have such strong characteristics of like salt and fat, your body kind of grows used to that, and so they just don't taste good over time. So that's the one food system that we looked at. And then another was the idea that if you're on Mars, you have gravity, so you could technically cook. So what if shelf-stable ingredients were sent along too, and then you could make creative meals. So you could make a cake, you could make a pizza, you could make a stir fry or a beef tagine. And so we did all of those things, and we alternated like 2 days on like pre-prepared meals and then 2 days on like the more creative meals. And we took a ton of surveys that captured our mood, our feelings about food, our excitement, our hunger, our how much we were satiated, and we took pictures of our plates and weighed the food and weighed the leftovers and weighed what we didn't eat. It was a very intensive data collection experience around the food that we were eating every day for all 3 meals. So that was the main project. But along with that, we were doing tests to determine like if our ability to identify smells changed over time over the course of the mission. And we were the control group for another group of NASA guinea pigs that were in Galveston, Texas, doing the bed rest studies. Do you know about this?
No.
So these people they laid at like a 6-degree angle, head down, to simulate the fluid shift and the muscle atrophy of low gravity. And they were also eating meals similar to ours and also taking these odor identification tests and mood surveys and all sorts of things. And so they acted as astronauts, say, because this experiment wasn't going to go to space, but you could do the next best thing and test it on bed rest subjects. So anyway, one of the odor ID tests that we got was this booklet with scratch and sniff little squares, and we would determine, what was what. Is this grass? Is this motor oil? Is this a rose? Is this lemon? Is this rubber? Is this, I don't know, charcoal? So you had all these things that you had to identify. Well, in the very beginning, it was so easy. I was maybe 1 or 2 I had to think about, based on the options because it was multiple choice. But, I just blasted through it. By the end of the mission, I was confused by many of them. I didn't know if it was, nothing as extreme as like rubber or lemon, but there were some options that I thought, well, this could honestly go either way. So I observed in myself, my sense of smell became confused. And I wonder if that had anything to do with a sort of lack of diversity of smells, of odors in the habitat.
Whoa, that's kind of scary. How long did it take? Do you feel like you got it back completely?
I don't know. I haven't continued with those tests, so I can't say, but I haven't noticed a certain deficiency in my ability to identify odors. Just yesterday, I picked up a new book that someone had, and I did notice that it smelled like a new book. And so probably I'm fine. I'm back to normal. But yeah, I think I love the idea of essential oils and a sort of like rotating odor therapy in a way of, getting that fix. Oh, that's a really cool idea. I think I had another thing I was going to say, but I'm not quite sure if I remember it. And that was a long story. So I think okay. It's fine. Yeah.
So there's a theme here, whether it's spending all your time in the physics building or spending all your time in a habitat module or spending all your time like on a laptop at a desk somewhere doing the writer's life, which is the theme of confinement. Yep. And then also, you mentioned early in our email correspondence that you also teach or have taught in a women's prison. And for various reasons having to do with my conscientious objection in the war for cognitive liberty / living in Texas. I've had my run-ins with the law, and I'm curious what you have learned from your time working with prisons and the people confined therein.
Well, the first time I ever heard about people teaching in prisons was when I was in college, and my math professor, my favorite math professor, taught at Leavenworth, and I asked her about it because to me that just seemed really scary. The idea of being amongst hardened criminals. I was young and kind of dumb. I didn't have a good sense of what that actually meant. She said, "Well, I truly believe that education is the best way to reduce recidivism, and I'm not a proponent of punishment. I'm a proponent of education, and I participate in these programs because I think that it's the best thing that we can do." And so she also gave me some details. She said, these are the sort of cream of the crop. These are very motivated students, extremely well behaved. They have goals for themselves inside and eventually on the outside. And they work very hard. She said they're some of the best students I've ever taught. And so that's when I first learned about that. But then I finally had an opportunity to do that when I was living in Nashville, and there was a women's prison there. And it was a fantastic experience because you do have these motivated students who are coming from all different perspectives and walks of life. And you just, especially when you teach creative writing, like stuff just starts to sort of crack open for them. And they get to say the things that they feel and maybe think that, like, if they're taking an accounting class or something like that, that's not a place where they can really explore some of the things that they think about, And so creative writing is just really a wonderful thing, I think, in prisons. And at Columbia, there's a program where we publish poems and stories. We solicit submissions for the journal by prisoners, and they submit poems and stories or essays, and then we publish those, and we also send letters to every one of them, telling them, giving them feedback on their stories, whether or not they're published, and that's just, that's like a real human connection, I believe, and I think that that's a really important thing because, we're speaking right now during the prison strike that began August 21st. And, this is modern day slavery. And there are more people incarcerated in the United States than in any other Western country. And it's because it's profitable. And I think that something needs to change. And I think that just like one thing at a very basic level that you can do is recognize that people in prisons are still part of your community, and you have a responsibility to them to give what you can to make sure that their lives are better, so that all of our lives are better.
Yeah, there's something about where you can tell a society by how it treats its young, its elderly, its insane, quote unquote, right? And it's criminals, like how does it treat its prisoners? And it's like these people, it's like, oh, I'd so much rather be in a European jail than in an American jail. I was a production assistant for a documentary about the American prison industrial system back in 2010. And yeah, it's just one of the things that really stuck with me was that recognizing the humanity of the people that I was sort of inclined by conditioning to consider the enemy. And, not just the prisoners, but the judges, the probation officers, all of these folks that were in some sense even more trapped in the system.
They're acting out exactly the cruelty that's been embedded in the policies and like the engineering of the system. Yeah.
So, to paste that kind of roughly on top of the space travel piece of it, I think, part of it is that I don't know how much mission design thinks about that sort of banal cruelty when it comes to forcing people. I mean, obviously they must. My buddy's dad is a NASA psychologist, and I know that they're, doing extensive personality evaluations and that kind of thing. But yeah, there's just got to be.
Yeah, I think there's a sense that an astronaut who has proven themselves and appears to have the wherewithal to endure like a very long mission can take pretty much anything, for a chance to go to Mars. So I think that in terms of engineering, there are some considerations, but ultimately there's a lot riding on the adaptability of the actual astronaut themselves. So, and what they can withstand. Yeah, space is an interesting thing because a lot of people really like to think about it. Like when I was a kid, I loved to think about it because it seems so vast and difficult to comprehend. And it seemed to like the idea of space and like that I was a part of it made me, as a kid, it made me feel like bigger. And that was super empowering. But the nice paradox is that in order to actually engage in space exploration, you are ultra confined in a very tiny space. I mean, the International Space Station and those modules are just jammed packed full of stuff. When you're out in space, you're in a spacesuit. You're contained. You're confined. It's the smallest spaceship there is. And a Mars habitat, I think really what would happen is it would have to be inside a cave somewhere to shield from radiation, cosmic rays and solar rays. So, and you're going to have the bubble that you're in anyway. And so, I mean, you go so far to explore and like embiggen, I guess, humanity, but you are stuck like in a dome inside a cave. It's really, and you can go out sometimes, but you're probably not going to be going out that much. It's probably going to be your rover pets that are going to be doing a lot of the exploring because who knows what that Mars dust would do to damage systems, and especially the transfer of that dust. We know that moon dust was incredibly harmful to the seals on the gloves that attach to the spacesuits, and also the seals were broken on the boxes that the moon rocks were transported in. So the dust is corrosive, and I mean it might not be as bad on Mars, but there's still not a lot known about that sort of challenge.
Oh.
So, yeah,
that specific thing. Today I don't know when this is going to get released, but we're recording it on what is the first day of Burning Man this year. And anyone who's been to Burning Man...
That's why the restaurants this weekend were not as crowded. Okay.
Oh, yeah. In San Francisco, no doubt. It's like a ghost town right now.
Yeah, we're definitely able to get a table.
So the thing about that is anybody who's been out to the playa knows that it really does sort of feel like how you imagine the lunar surface, just this very fine white dust for as far as the eye can see. And it gets into everything and it never comes completely out. And my partner and I joke about, everyone talks about how I went to Burning Man and now, I've been liberated. I've had, my life has been transformed. It's like, well, there's the other side of it, which is that you take a tent out to Burning Man and it just gets ruined, And so it's like, well, it's been to Burning Man and now it's free. As in, like, it's in the free box at the store.
Yeah, it's like that's right. If it's liberated from use.
Yeah, and actually, Cory Doctorow wrote a short story about that for the Project Hieroglyph compilation, where Burning Man as the setting for his characters' prototyping stuff that they were going to take into space. Actually, so I don't know.
Well, Hank Rogers is the. He owns the rights to Tetris, and he is a local space buff in Hawaii, and he's affiliated with the High Seas Project, and that the habitat that we lived in was his. He funded that. NASA essentially rents it from him. And his architect is the one who designed it, and they have a significant presence at Burning Man. So it was. It's probably no accident. I think that there is a ton of crossover between the Burning Man crowd and the space crowd, and Yeah, we're grateful for Hank and his support for the project because it really made it happen.
Huh.
But there's a little bit of Burning Man in high seas too.
Right on. Well, I guess, and you're a very interesting person, and I could continue picking your brain forever, I'm sure. But out of respect for your time, let's wrap this up, shall we? I have a question I like to ask everybody at the end of these, which is, if you imagine that this show survives to be heard by people that, won't be born by the time we're dead, there's like complete discontinuity between our lives and theirs. And that makes them probably very fascinating to us and vice versa. What would you want to know? And like, what would you hope to communicate through the aeons to someone who doesn't understand what it's like to be alive today?
Yeah. Huge question. What would I like to know? I think I would like to know in what ways they make their lives easier and in what ways they make their lives harder. And how aware they are of either of those things.
They might have to have an AI answer for them, right?
Right.
If they're not aware.
Would that make that easier or harder for them in what ways?
Yeah. And what would you say?
I hope they're still reading poetry.
Oh, yeah. I love it. Kate, thank you so much. Where can people connect with you? Where can they find your work and so forth?
I'm on Twitter, Greene. I'm on Instagram, Kate_Greene. I have a webpage, kategreene.net.
It's Greene with an E, folks, if you're not looking at this. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. Super appreciate it.
Thank you, Michael. It was a real pleasure.
Thanks again for listening. I hope you enjoyed that episode as much as I did. Future Fossils is part of the MindPod network, along with Third Eye Drops, the Astral Hustle, Synchronicity Podcast, and an oodle of other fascinating programs. I encourage you to go to mindpodnetwork.com and subscribe to them all. And stay tuned, because we have some awesome episodes coming up on Future Fossils. But for now, may your now be exquisite, long, and wonderful.